This is a story of a pregnant nurse who stood her ground when power tried to knock her down, and a billionaire who hid in plain sight.
The sharp, ugly crack of a palm against a woman's face. She was 7 months pregnant. She was on her feet for the 11th hour of a 12-hour shift. She had not eaten since 6 in the morning, and the only thing keeping her upright was the same thing that had kept her upright every single day for the last 8 years. The knowledge that somewhere on the other side of one of these doors, someone needed her more than she needed rest. Her name was Amara Idris, and in 47 seconds, a man in a $3,000 suit was going to walk through those doors and change her life forever. He didn't know she was watching him. He didn't know that the quiet man reading a newspaper in the waiting room, the one in the worn jacket with the scuffed shoes and no watch, had been watching him for the last 20 minutes. Oh, he didn't know anything, really. That was his problem. That had always been his problem. The Mercy General Hospital Labour and Delivery Wing was not a glamorous place to work. It smelled like industrial soap and latex, and something beneath both of those. Something you couldn't name until the first time you witnessed a birth at 2 in the morning and understood that it was the smell of lives beginning, raw and loud and terrifying. Amara had delivered her first baby as a nurse at 24 years old. The mother had been 16, alone, and so frightened she had grabbed Amara's hand and refused to let go for 3 hours. Amara had held her through all of it. She had murmured things she didn't entirely believe just to make them feel true. She had not cried until she got to her car. She had been doing that ever since. She was 32 now, 8 years on this floor. She had seen the full spectrum of what a human being could be. The fathers who fainted, the grandmothers who prayed in 4 languages, the mothers who laughed through contractions, and the ones who went completely silent in a way that frightened everyone. She had been there for the deliveries that went beautifully and for the ones that did not. She had held hands in both kinds of rooms. She was, by every measure that actually mattered, extraordinary at her job. She was also 7 months pregnant with her first child. The father was not in the picture. He had left when she told him. She had spent 1 weekend crying, and then she had gone back to work, because that was what she did. She did not tell her co-workers when the pregnancy became difficult, and she did not mention the swelling in her ankles or the headaches that sometimes came on so sharp she had to stand very still and breathe through them. She just kept moving, because the moment you stopped moving on this floor, someone suffered for it. She had a gift, not the mystical kind, nothing you could put in a brochure. It was something simpler and harder to explain. When Amara walked into a room, the temperature in it changed. Patients who had been crying stopped. Machines that had been alarming seemed to settle. The other nurses sometimes joked that she had a superpower. She did not have a superpower. She just cared so completely, so without reservation, that people felt it and their bodies responded. You can call that whatever you want. She called it a job. On the morning of November the 14th, and she had already handled 2 complicated deliveries, counseled a woman whose ultrasound had revealed devastating news, and talked a frightened 20-year-old first-time father off a metaphorical ledge in the hallway near the supply closet. It was 1:47 in the afternoon. She was writing notes at the nurses' station when the elevator opened. His name was Gerald Ashworth III. Yes, the third. He had insisted on that, even in casual introductions, with a completeness that told you everything about the kind of man he was. He was 51 years old. He had made his money in commercial real estate, the particular kind of real estate that involved buying buildings in neighborhoods where poor people lived, allowing those buildings to deteriorate to the precise legal edge of uninhabitability, and then converting them into luxury apartments once the neighborhood had been successfully emptied of everyone who had given it its soul. He had done this 9 times in 4 cities. He was very rich. He was also, in the way of men who confuse power with permission, completely unbearable to be around. He had 2 ex-wives. Both of them had described him, in separate interviews with their separate lawyers, using the same phrase. He doesn't hear the word no. He hears it as a suggestion. His employees sent each other a code word when he arrived at the office. His driver had once pulled over on the highway and asked to be let out of the vehicle. Gerald had told that story at a dinner party as though it was amusing. Today, Gerald Ashworth III had arrived at Mercy General with his assistant, Marcus, who was 26 years old, and visibly anxious at all times, and carrying a leather portfolio that contained a document Gerald wanted delivered to a patient on the maternity ward, his younger sister, Eleanor, who had just given birth to her second child, and whom Gerald planned to persuade, while she was exhausted and emotionally vulnerable, to sign over her share of their late father's estate. That was the kind of man Gerald Ashworth III was. He had not called ahead. He never called ahead. Calling ahead was for people who needed to ask permission. He stepped off the elevator with his collar open and his jaw set, and the particular walk of a man who has never once stood in a line. Marcus scrambled behind him, portfolio clutched to his chest. At the nurse's station, Amara looked up. She noted immediately that neither of them was wearing a visitor's bracelet. She noted the open collar, the aggressive stride, the complete absence of any deference toward a space that was, quite literally, a space where women were giving birth. She stepped out from behind the station. "Good afternoon," she said. "Can I help you?" Gerald barely looked at her. "Eleanor Ashworth. What room?" "Are you family?" "I'm her brother." "I'll need to check with Mrs. Ashworth before I can—" "I don't need you to check anything." He said it like a correction, not a statement. "She's expecting me." Amara paused. "She is not listed as expecting visitors this afternoon. Our policy for postpartum patients is that unannounced. Your policy." Gerald finally looked at her. Fully. His eyes went to her face, then down to her belly, and he made a sound. Not quite a laugh, and something shorter and uglier, like the sight of her pregnancy was somehow inconvenient information. "Your policy is a set of guidelines written by a committee so that nurses who are not doctors don't make medical decisions above their pay grade. It is not a law. What room?" The nurses' station had gone quiet. 2 other nurses, Blessing and a young student nurse named Chinwe, had stopped what they were doing. Amara held his gaze. "Sir, I understand you'd like to see your sister. I'm going to call her room and let her know you're here. If she confirms she wants the visit, I will personally walk you to her door. That is our process, and it exists to protect our patients. All of them." Gerald stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what I donated to this hospital last year?" The amount he named made Marcus flinch, though Marcus had heard the number many times. "I appreciate that," Amara said. "Our patients appreciate it. The process still applies." "The process?" He said the word like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "You are a nurse at a public hospital, and you are standing in my way." "I am doing my job." "Your job is to follow instructions, not to block." "My job," Amara said. And something shifted very slightly in her voice, something that Blessing, who had worked with her for 4 years, had heard only twice before, a quiet that was not softness but its opposite, "is to protect the people in my care. That is what I was trained to do. That is what I am doing. Now, if you'll give me 60 seconds, I will call Mrs. Ashworth's room." She turned toward the phone, but Gerald Ashworth III crossed the space between them in 4 steps. He grabbed her arm, hard. She turned, startled, and when she did, the motion brought her sideways, and his other hand, whether in reflex or intent, in that moment it made no difference, came up and struck her across the side of her face. Open palm. Full force. The sound of it was devastating in that quiet hallway. Amara's head snapped to the right. She stumbled back against the station counter. Her hands went immediately, instinctively, desperately to her stomach. Both of them, wrapping around the full curve of her belly, protecting the child inside her with the only thing she had. She did not fall. She stood, hands on her belly, eyes closed for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that contained everything. The ward was absolutely silent, or Blessing had both hands over her mouth. Chinwe had gone white. The security guard at the far end of the corridor had his hand on his radio and had not pressed anything yet. Gerald straightened. He adjusted his watch. He looked at Marcus and then back at Amara and said, calmly, the way someone speaks when they believe they have already won, "Get out of my way, or next time I'll use the other hand." He walked past her. He had taken 4 steps toward Eleanor's corridor when a voice came from behind him. Quiet, measured, with the particular texture of a voice that has never needed to raise itself to be heard. "Sir." Gerald stopped. He turned. The man standing near the waiting room chairs was not remarkable to look at. Early 50s, worn jacket, dark trousers with a slight crease that had long since faded. A paperback novel folded in one hand. He had a face that had seen things and processed them privately. Silver at his temples, no jewelry, no watch. "Did you just strike that nurse?" the man said. Gerald looked him over, made the same calculation he always made, the quick visual assessment of whether a person counted. The worn jacket registered, the absence of a watch registered, the paperback novel registered. Gerald turned back around. "Mind your business," he said. The man sat back down and picked up his newspaper. Gerald walked to Eleanor's room. Marcus stood in the corridor, looking at Amara, looking at the floor, looking at his portfolio, unable to meet anyone's eyes. In the immediate aftermath, the ward moved through its obligations. A formal incident report was filed. The security guard, whose name was Dotun, wrote down exactly what he had witnessed. Blessing filed a separate statement. Chinwe, hands trembling, wrote 3 attempts before she got one she could submit without her sentences falling apart. The floor manager, a woman named Mrs. Okafor, arrived within minutes. She was efficient and pale-faced, and she took Amara into her office and asked if she needed medical attention. Amara said she was fine. Mrs. Okafor looked at the mark on her face and said she was sorry. She said it in the way people say things they mean, but have no power to do anything about. The hospital administrator, a man named Percival Shaw, arrived 30 minutes after that. He had received a call from Gerald Ashworth III, who had, during the 10 minutes he had spent in his sister's room, placed 4 calls to his lawyer, to his publicist, as to a board member of Mercy General Hospital he played golf with on Thursdays, and to Percival Shaw, whose direct line Gerald had obtained through the Golf Thursday board member. What Gerald had told each of them was a story. It was his story, and it bore no resemblance to the 47 seconds of footage captured on the corridor camera. But it was his story, and he told it with confidence and fluency, because he had been telling his version of events for 51 years, and no one had ever successfully offered a competing narrative. In his story, the nurse had been obstructive and aggressive. She had grabbed his arm. There had been a scuffle. He had no idea how the mark on her face had occurred. He was deeply concerned about the welfare of the child she was carrying, and he felt the hospital owed him an apology. Then Percival Shaw knocked on Mrs. Okafor's door and entered the office where Amara was sitting with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. He sat across from her. He had the look of a man who has made a decision before entering a room and is now arranging his face to deliver it. Amara, he said, I want to start by saying that we value your service here enormously. She knew then. Before he said the next word, she knew. Given the sensitivity of the situation, Percival said, and the complexity of the relationships involved, I'm going to have to ask you to take a period of administrative leave while we conduct a full review. She looked at him. You saw the footage. We are reviewing the footage. Dotun wrote a statement. Blessing wrote a statement. Chinwe, all of those will be part of the review. He struck me, Amara said. I am 7 months pregnant. He struck me across the face in full view of 4 members of staff and 1 security officer, and at least 2 patients who were in the corridor. Percival Shaw looked at his hands. Administrative leave, he said again. Effective today, full pay. We will be in touch. She stood. She did not cry in front of him. She would not give the room that. She cleaned out the small things from her locker. A lip balm, a photograph of her mother, a small plastic giraffe that one of her patients had given her years ago, and that she kept because on bad days it made her smile. She put them in her pockets and walked out. In the lobby, she sat for a moment on one of the hard plastic chairs near the main entrance. She was replaying the afternoon, trying to locate the moment she could have done something different, and when a paper cup of coffee appeared at the edge of her vision, held by a hand she didn't recognize. She looked up. It was the man from the waiting room, worn jacket, paperback still in his other hand. Up close, his eyes were calm, in a way that was unusual. Not blank, not cold, but genuinely settled, like someone who had resolved a long time ago not to be rattled by things. Hospital coffee is terrible, he said, but it's hot, which is the only thing that matters right now. She stared at him. Do I know you? No. He sat down in the chair beside her, not too close, without asking, but with the instinct of someone who understood that a person in distress does not need formality, they need presence. I was in the waiting area. My name is Thomas. You saw? Yes. And you're the man who said sir at him. Her voice was flat. And then he ignored you and walked away. Yes. He said it without embarrassment. I let him. She looked at him. Why? Thomas set his own coffee cup on the chair beside him and looked at his paperback for a moment. Because there's more than one way to respond to a man like that, he said. Stopping him in a hospital corridor was one option. It would have resulted in a scene, possible escalation, and no lasting consequence for him whatsoever. He paused. I prefer lasting consequences. Amara studied him. He had the kind of face that gave away nothing but also hid nothing. What does that mean? It means I've already made 3 calls, he said simply, and I'd like to make 1 more, if you'll let me. Who are you? He reached into the inside pocket of the worn jacket and placed a card on the chair between them. Plain white, embossed text, no logo. She read the card. She read it again. She looked at the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the paperback, the hospital coffee. I am, he said. Why are you this? She gestured at his appearance. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Almost a smile. Almost, but with something older and wearier underneath it. Because people treat you very differently when they think you have nothing, he said. I learned a long time ago that the most honest version of any room is the version where nobody knows who you are. He picked up his coffee. I've been a patient in this hospital twice in the last 3 years, under a different name. I've watched this floor. I know what happens here. I know what the people on this floor do. He glanced toward the corridor she'd come from. And I know what was just done to one of them. She was very still. Who did you call? She asked. His lawyer's senior partner, Thomas said. A journalist, I trust. A federal contact who has had an open interest in Mr. Ashworth's financial practices for approximately 18 months. He paused. And I would like, with your permission, to call my legal team so that you have representation before tomorrow morning. Amara held the coffee cup with both hands and looked at the wall ahead of her. He told them I was aggressive, she said quietly. He told the administrator I grabbed his arm. I know. They suspended me. I know that too. I'm 7 months pregnant, she said. Her voice did not break, but it moved close to something. I have been on this floor for 8 years. I have never had a single complaint, not one. She exhaled, and he walked past me and they suspended me. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then, yes, he did, and they did. He let that sit. And now you and I are going to make sure that the last true thing Gerald Ashworth III ever does with the name his grandfather gave him is sign documents. She looked at him. What documents? She said. We'll get to that, Thomas said. First, are you all right? The baby, have you been checked? She hadn't. She realized she hadn't. He stood. Come on, he said. Let's get you checked. Everything else can wait 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and followed him, and the lobby doors opened, and outside, the sun had come out from behind a thick plate of cloud, and the afternoon light was doing something unexpected and beautiful to the wet street. And Thomas Eade was not in the Forbes list. He had been once, briefly, 8 years ago, when a renewable energy company he had built from 30 employees to 3,000 had been acquired for a sum that made financial journalists reach for historical comparisons. He had hated the attention. He had restructured everything immediately afterward. 9 separate entities, none of them publicly linked to his name. And he had returned to the only life he had ever genuinely wanted. Anonymous, observant, and free to walk into a public hospital in a worn jacket and drink bad coffee without anyone trying to give him anything. He had never wanted anything he hadn't earned. He had no patience for inherited power. He had no patience for men who built their identities on other people's smallness. On Gerald Ashworth III had been a name on his radar for 2 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with a hospital. A community housing project that Thomas had quietly funded in the city's east side, affordable homes for working families, a genuine attempt at something real, had been systematically blocked, rezoned, and ultimately killed by commercial opposition that traced, through 5 layers of legal entities, back to one name. Gerald had never met Thomas. Thomas had never contacted Gerald. But Thomas knew exactly who Gerald was, and what he was, and what he had done. He had been building a file, patiently and without urgency, because Thomas Eade operated on a philosophy he had developed over 53 years of watching the world. The right moment is not the fastest moment. It is the one that leaves no door open. November the 14th was the right moment. He had been at Mercy General that afternoon, visiting a former employee who had undergone cardiac surgery, a man named Francis, who had worked in Thomas's warehouse division for 30 years and who had no family. Thomas had brought him books and sat with him for an hour and was on his way out when the elevator had opened. He had watched the entire thing. He had said, "Sir," not because he expected a response, but because he wanted Gerald to register that he had been seen. He had then sat back down. He had then opened his phone, placed 3 calls, and sent 2 emails. And then he had waited, because he knew exactly what the administrator would do, and he wanted to be there when Amara came through the lobby. So by the time Amara was being seen by an obstetrician in a consultation room down the hall, the following things had already been set in motion. Gerald Ashworth III's lead legal firm had received a communication from a firm with considerably more resources, informing them that any action taken against Amara Idris any lawsuit, any formal complaint, any negative public statement, would be met with the full release of documentation relating to 17 instances of building code violation, 4 cases of tenant harassment, and 2 incidents of falsified safety inspections across Gerald's property portfolio. The communication had been read by the senior partner, who had immediately called Gerald's personal mobile and told him that the firm was withdrawing from his representation, effective that afternoon. Gerald had not understood why. That information would reach him over the next 24 hours, in pieces, each piece worse than the last. The journalist Thomas trusted, a woman named Adaiz, who wrote for a national investigative outlet, had been sent the corridor footage, along with a timeline of events, a copy of Amara's employment record, and a detailed note about the administrator's decision. Adaiz had cleared her afternoon and made 4 calls of her own. The federal contact, a compliance officer named Webb, who had been quietly frustrated for 18 months by Gerald's ability to stay one legal step ahead of an investigation that had stalled 3 times due to a lack of specific documentation, had received a package. The package contained the specific documentation. Thomas had been collecting it slowly and without announcing himself, to the way water collects in a dam, until the moment the dam is opened. He had also that evening placed a 4th call, to the board of Mercy General Hospital, to the specific board member who had called Percival Shaw that afternoon. Thomas did not raise his voice on this call. He laid out in precise and unhurried language what had occurred, what he had witnessed, what he intended to do about it, and what he expected the board to do about Percival Shaw's decision within 72 hours. He did not threaten. He did not need to. By the end of the call, the board member was doing the kind of rapid calculations that men do when they suddenly understand that the geography of a situation has completely changed. It came apart the way these things always come apart for men who believe they are invulnerable. Not in one catastrophic explosion, but in a sequence of small, cold realizations, each one closing a door he had assumed would always be open. It began with his lawyer's call. Gerald dismissed it. Lawyers changed firms. He would find another one. Then his publicist called. She had seen something circulating, early, unverified, but moving fast. A corridor, a nurse, a face, hands going instinctively to a pregnant belly. She needed to know his position. Gerald told her his position. She told him that was not going to be sufficient and that she was going to need to step away from the account. This was the 2nd call. He found out about the federal documentation package on the morning of the 2nd day, when Webb's office made a formal notification to his company's compliance department. The compliance officer on Gerald's team called him, and Gerald sat in his car in the garage of his building for 45 minutes without starting the engine. On the morning of the 3rd day, the article ran. Adaize had written it with the precision and care of someone who understood that the story did not need embellishment. She wrote exactly what had happened, in the order it had happened, with the footage referenced, the witness statements quoted, and a careful, thorough account of Gerald Ashworth III's property history in the city. She wrote about the community housing project that had been killed. She wrote about the families who had been displaced. She wrote about Amara Idris, 8 years on the maternity ward, not a single complaint, 7 months pregnant, suspended within an hour of being assaulted by a donor. The article did not call Gerald a monster. It didn't need to. It simply described what he had done, in clean sentences, and let the reader's own moral compass do its work. By noon of that day, the article had been shared 240,000 times. By the following morning, 3 of Gerald's commercial tenants, large corporate clients whose logos on his buildings had given him a certain legitimacy, had formally terminated their leases. His sister Eleanor, who had signed nothing and whom Gerald had not actually managed to speak to coherently during the 10 minutes in her hospital room, because she had been exhausted and confused, and he had been too aggressive and too fast. Read the article from her hospital bed. She called her own lawyer. She called her childhood friend. Then she called the journalist. She had things to say. She said them. And Gerald spent the 4th day attempting to negotiate. This was the instinct of a man who had built his life on negotiation, on the belief that everything had a price and everyone had a number. He reached out through intermediaries. The intermediaries came back with the same answer, worded differently each time, but meaning the same thing. There is no number. On the 5th day, the federal compliance process formally opened. Gerald Ashworth III sat in his penthouse, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the city he had spent a career reshaping, and looked at the lights below and understood, slowly and completely, that the city had been reshaped again, and that this time he had not been the one doing the reshaping. He had lost the article. He was losing the contracts. He was losing the legal protection. And he would lose the investigation. He knew this with the cold certainty of a man who knew exactly what was in those files, because he had put it there. He had walked past a pregnant woman on a hospital ward and slapped her for doing her job. And the man in the worn jacket reading a paperback in the waiting room had been watching. Amara was reinstated on the 7th day. The board had voted. The vote had not been close. Percival Shaw did not resign. He was asked to. The phrasing in the official communication used the language of mutual agreement, which both he and everyone who read it understood to be a courtesy extended in the direction of institutional tidiness rather than reality. A formal apology was issued, not the corporate kind, the kind written by a committee to protect everyone and say nothing. Thomas had made clear, or in his communication with the board, that the apology needed to be specific, personal, and signed by an actual human being rather than a department. The board chair wrote it himself. It was 3 paragraphs. It named what had happened. It named Amara by name. It said the word assault without softening it. She read it at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with both hands around a cup of tea, her feet up on a second chair because her ankles had been bad that week. She read it twice. She did not feel triumph exactly. Something quieter, something that had more to do with being seen than with being vindicated, because she had known all along what had happened, and the violence of it had been real regardless of whether anyone official had confirmed it. What the apology gave her was not the truth. She had already had the truth. And so what it gave her was the confirmation that other people now had it too, and could no longer pretend otherwise. Thomas visited once, 2 weeks after everything had settled. He came to the hospital on a Thursday afternoon in the worn jacket. He brought terrible hospital coffee and a book for Blessing, who had mentioned to Amara that she had been meaning to read it, and Amara had mentioned it to Thomas during one of their phone calls, and he had noted it without comment and appeared on Thursday with the book, which told Blessing everything she needed to know about the kind of person he was. Amara walked with him in the hospital garden for 20 minutes. It was cold. She had her coat buttoned over her belly, and she walked slowly, and he matched her pace without making it obvious that he was doing so. "How are you?" he asked. "Oh, tired," she said. "Grateful." Both at once. "The baby?" "Perfect. They keep telling me she is perfect." She looked at him sideways. "She is absolutely going to be a nurse." He smiled. It was a full one this time, without the weariness underneath it. "Or something that drives nurses absolutely mad," he said. She laughed. It came out surprised, which meant it was real. They walked a little further. "The housing project," she said. "The one that was killed." He glanced at her. He had told her about it in their second conversation, without making it about himself, just as context. "We're rebuilding the application," he said. different approach, should move faster this time. Because Gerald is no longer in the way. Because Gerald is no longer in the way, he confirmed simply. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. I want to say something, she said. And I need you to not deflect it or be modest about it or change the subject. He waited. What you did, she said, was not nothing. I know you'll say you just made some calls. I know you'll say the system did the rest. I know you'll say anyone would have done the same. She stopped walking and turned to look at him fully. No one did the same. For 7 days, every person in that building with authority stood with the man who hit me. You were in a waiting room, reading a paperback, with no reason to be involved, and you chose to be involved. She held his gaze. That is not nothing. Don't let it be nothing. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, It was never nothing to me. She turned back towards the hospital doors. Come on, she said. The coffee is terrible inside, but at least it's warm. On the 22nd of February at 4:38 in the morning, Amara Idris delivered her daughter in the same hospital, on the same ward, surrounded by the same colleagues she had spent 8 years building her life beside. Blessing held one hand. Chinwe, who was no longer a student nurse, held the other. The birth was not simple. It was long and frightening in the middle part, and then it was over, and the baby announced herself to the ward with the kind of volume that suggested she had opinions and intended to share them at every available opportunity. Amara held her daughter and looked at her face. She was dark-haired and furious, and absolutely, completely, perfectly herself. Then Amara kissed her forehead and breathed in the warmth of her, and said her name for the first time out loud, a name she had chosen 4 months ago and told no one. Ada Ora. It meant, in her mother's language, her people's daughter. She had worked for this. She had protected this. She had stood in a hallway with a mark on her face and her hands on her belly, and she had not fallen, and now here was the proof that something had been worth protecting all along. Gerald Ashworth III was in the middle of a federal compliance process that his new legal team had described, carefully and professionally, as complex. His commercial portfolio had shrunk by 60%. His sister had given an interview. 3 former tenants had come forward. He had moved out of the penthouse. He had not been charged yet. These things moved slowly, but they moved, and Thomas had learned to trust in the movement of things. Dr. Percival Shaw had taken a position at a smaller facility on the other side of the city. He had signed his letter of mutual agreement and departed without a ceremony. Nobody organized one. The board had appointed an interim administrator who had, as her first act, commissioned a full review of the hospital's donor relations policy. Specifically, the sections governing what donors were and were not permitted to do with their perceived influence over staff decisions. The review took 3 months. The new policy was specific and unambiguous, and it had Amara's name in the acknowledgements at her request. Thomas Eder had returned to his ordinary life of worn jackets and terrible coffee and books, and quietly building things that lasted. He had sent flowers to the maternity ward on the morning of the 22nd. A simple card, congratulations to her people's daughter, and to her mother, who held the floor. He had not signed it with his full name. He didn't need to. She had wanted to be normal. She had built a normal life with her own hands, shift by shift, year by year, patient by patient. And one afternoon, a man in a $3,000 suit had walked through a door and decided that her normalcy was an inconvenience. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about the nurse. He had been wrong about the quiet man in the waiting room. He had been wrong about the city. He had been wrong about the walls of his own power. Because power isn't the man with the loudest voice, or the largest donation, or the longest list of people who are afraid to say no. Power is the woman who stands between a vulnerable person and something that wants to harm them. Power is the person who absorbs the worst someone can throw and puts her hands on her belly and does not fall. Power is the one who was watching from the corner of the room and said "sir" without raising his voice, and then sat back down and made 4 calls and changed everything. The quietest people in the room are never the weakest. Never. They are simply the ones deciding when. When Percival Shaw chose to suspend Amara instead of Gerald, was he a coward, or do you think he genuinely believed Gerald's version of events? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I want to hear what you think. If Thomas had not been sitting in that waiting room that afternoon, do you believe Amara would ever have gotten justice? Or would Gerald have walked away untouched? Tell me in the comments, and tell me why. If this story moved something in you, if you felt Amara's dignity in that hallway, if Thomas's quiet strength gave you chills, if you believe that the right people always find each other when it matters most, then you are exactly where you belong. This is Souls and Heart Tales, where every story is real in the ways that count, where justice doesn't always arrive loudly, but it always arrives, where the people the world overlooks turn out to be the ones the world cannot do without. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Because the next one might just be the most powerful thing you've heard all year. Welcome to the family.